Okay, how's that?
There you are, yes.
Okay, sorry about that, folks. I'm just, I'm a bit of a Luddite with these things. And, that was very kind of you to say all that, Melody, because I was a bit apprehensive about doing this, to be honest. And it's going to be a bit more chatty than I've been listening in, dipping in this weekend. Unfortunately, I couldn't do much yesterday because I was out at some sort of film premiere thing. But to be honest, it's brilliant what you've been doing, and your speakers are also so terrific, and I'm a bit overawed really. But anyway, right, let me get started. And I'm afraid I don't do this PowerPoint thing, as you know, so you'll just have to basically listen rather than sort of see stuff, but all these things I'm talking about anyway. All right, let me start and see if I can get through this. Right, so anyway, hello and welcome to all you friendly academics and horror fans out there. I'm Allan Bryce, and for the past 32 years I've been editing and publishing The Dark Side, which is a thankfully still popular magazine on the subject of the macabre and the fantastic. Though I guess this seemingly makes me an expert on the genre, I must admit I approached the concept of making a keynote speech on this one particular area with some sort of trepidation, because especially as the majority of today's speakers on the subject seem to have had a great deal more education on the subject of folk horror than yours truly. But it's great to be involved with a university project, because up until now my only contact with the classical halls of learning has been ferrying my two daughters back and forth to their respective universities. When I was a youngster, back in the dim and distant mist of time, the idea of studying film, or indeed any kind of media, would maybe have stopped me from walking out on my A-levels for a job in Waitrose, but my dad would never have let me get away with it. I remember him saying to me, "You'll never make a living writing about horror films." Well, that was probably one that he later realised was maybe a little bit ill-advised, but he still didn't think it was a good way of making a living. So there you go. You youngsters out there should never listen to your parents. That's just my bit of advice. Anyway, however, I'm just setting the stage here to make excuses early on in case I do a Boris and I lose the plot halfway through. Mind you, he didn't go to Leeds Beckett University, so cut him some slack maybe, I don't know. Anyway, so to folk horror, which has been ably dissected here today. But my own understanding of this rural subgenre is that it encompasses the merging of horror and landscape with a healthy dose of pagan ritual on the side. I should take a diversion here to recall a school outing of my childhood where I and my classmates attended a weekend country outing entitled "A Thing of Beauty is a Joy Forever." And this was intended to make us appreciate the values of great poetry, art and music and dissect everything, which you've done so ably today in here. But anyway, during an art class, which was taken by an extremely owl-like fellow, as I recall, the teacher asked for thoughts on a Renoir. And just because I thought, I knew I was a bit of a first-class bullshitter, to be honest, I could make it sound like I knew something, which hopefully I'll be doing today as well, when I really was just, winging it. So basically, I stepped forward and I said, I love Renoir's broken brushstrokes and his linear approach to the subject. And this owl-like chap, he gave a very deep sigh of satisfaction and he nodded happily. And I sort of began to dissect Auguste's use of pure complementary colours and things like that, So afterwards, he buttonholed me to find out how I knew so much about art. But the truth was, I just had a skim through my dad's art books, the ones he supposedly kept hidden away, and the memory had remained. So, you can get your inspiration from anywhere. Just that's the message of that little bit. Anyway, hopefully I won't be winging it as much today, because although I confess that folk horror is never going to be my specialty. Sorry, my dog's coughing in the background, quite funky. Was never going to be a specialist subject. It wasn't really even a subject at all, really, until sort of 2010, when Mark Gatiss used it in his History of Horror documentary for the BBC4. All these years later, it's now difficult to ignore. And perhaps in some sense, that is because we now are all, or should be, feeling more connected to our environment. The way things are going, we might be better having Lord Summerall in charge of the country in many ways, because at least he had a plan A. But anyway, I guess any discussion of the subject must start with the unholy trinity of folk horror titles, which has already been chatted about here. I'm sorry to go over old ground, but namely Witchfinder General, which is 1968, Blood and Saints Claw from 1971, and The Wicker Man from 1973. And as I say, they've already been discussed at length, but that is as it should be, because these are the classics of the genre and they sort of define the rules. So let's start with Witchfinder, which is, I think, is a genuine masterpiece of historical horror from the doomed Michael Reeves, who died from a barbiturate overdose, which may or may not have been suicide. But not long after the movie was first released, sadly. But Witchfinder was based on the real-life Matthew Hopkins, who was an English witch hunter whose career flourished during the English Civil War. He claimed to hold the office of Witchfinder General, although that title was never bestowed by Parliament, and mainly made life hell for lots of unfortunate women in East Anglia, especially the ones who owned too many cats for their own good. Still out there, actually. 57-year-old Vincent Price played Hopkins in the film, and he was axed to death at the end by a vengeful soldier, whilst historical records suggest, however, that the real-life Hopkins died in his bed of tuberculosis at the grand old age of 28. So, I don't know, they were very harsh times indeed, I guess. But anyway, director Michael Reeves famously wanted Donald Pleasance to play the part of Hopkins in his film, and he was frustrated when the American co-producers insisted on Vincent Price, who owed them a part under contract. The director and star didn't get on, and at one point Price told him, "I've made 84 films, what have you done?" And Reeves said, "I've made 2 good ones." Well, I think probably Vincent Price made more than 2 good ones, to be fair to him. Of course, Reeves was right in one way, though. He managed to get Vincent Price to steer away from his usual knowingly hammy performance to portray a far more complex character. And after the film's release, Price had the good grace to write Reeves a letter telling him that he finally understood what the director was trying to do, the kind of performance he was after. Certainly, the way that Price portrays Matthew Hopkins has so much more depth and menace than one would expect from him at this late stage in his career. He is a complex character who believes he is doing God's work and yet knows he is also a sinner because he yields to the sexual favours of Vicar's daughter, Hilary Dwyer, who will do anything to save her father, Rupert Davies, from being executed as an idolater. When people talk about Witchfinder General, one of the things that frequently comes up is the way that witch trials seemed to work in those days. Most specifically, that the accused were thrown in a river, and if they drowned, they were innocent, whilst if they survived, they were thought to have been aided by the devil and were therefore taken out and burned at the stake. Surely the very definition of Hobson's choice. Well, I wasn't looking for deep meanings or cultural education when I first viewed Witchfinder General on its cinema release in 1968, and I guess probably a lot of you weren't even born then, so yeah, just skate over that. But the things that most struck me about it were its vivid use of the British landscape and its beautiful Green Sleeves-inspired score by Paul Ferris, who incidentally has a small role in the film, and he gets shot to death. He's actually credited as Maurice Jarre, which is Morrisjar, whereas of course Maurice Jarre, the film composer, spells his name differently, but apparently that was the reason he called him that name, because Maurice Jarre was his favourite film composer. That's a bit of trivia. Anyway, back in the day, I kept a schoolboy diary of my reviews, and I note that I said at the time about Witchfinder General, surely this is the most beautifully photographed horror film I've ever seen. Maybe after Mask of the Red Death. They're both beautiful. Of course, key to the film's folk horror credentials are that it's rooted in the true life superstitions of the day, the belief that witches really existed, yet it's a movie about politically motivated evil and how human paranoia can be manipulated by those in power with their own selfish agendas at heart. We must all be thankful this could not happen today. Of course. By the way, it's interesting to note that the Witchcraft Act was a law passed by Parliament in 1735, which made it a crime for a person to claim that any human being had magical powers or was guilty of practicing witchcraft. With this, the law abolished the hunting and executions of witches in Great Britain. The maximum penalty set out by the Act was a year's imprisonment, and the last person convicted under the Act was Jane Rebecca York of Forest Gate in East London. On 26th of September 1944, at the Central Criminal Court, York was convicted on 7 counts of pretending to cause the spirits of deceased persons to be present. Yeah. Okay, it wasn't until 1951 that the Witchcraft Act was repealed, and interestingly, there was an explosion of books and films on the subject after that. So let's move on to The Blood on Satan's Claw, the second film in the classic British folk horror trilogy. Again, unlike you learned young folk out there, I saw this when I first went around UK cinemas. And on first viewing, I thought it was an interesting British rural horror, though not up to the standard of Witchfinder General. That's just what I used to do these little reviews in my schoolboy notebooks. In preparing for my rambling chat, I did do a bit of research. Honest, I did, and I would recommend a book by accomplished film scholar Andrew Scoville. I think his name's come up, many times today. Whose careful study of the subgenre arrives at 4 important elements of folk horror: landscape, isolation, skewed moral beliefs, and some kind of happening or summoning. And all of those 4 boxes are ticked in Blood on Satan's Claw, which is a very stylish effort, which I'm sure you've all seen, which serves up some very good scares as well. The setting is, in this one, of course, is 17th century England, where an evil influence takes over a small rural community. And Linda Hayden has one of her best roles as Angel, a seductive young blonde who swans around nude doing the devil's work as I guess that's no complaints about that, really. We actually get to see old Nick at one point, and he or she, indeed, is depicted as a hairy creature with long, sharp claws. And Patrick Wymark, who played Oliver Cromwell in Witchfinder, turns in a solid performance here in the Peter Cushing role of a judge who tries to put a stop to the evil. There's also a nice bucolic score by Mike Wilkinson, which, again, these films have all got, all these 3 classic horrors have got brilliant music scores. I mentioned previously that folk horror didn't really seem to be part of the public consciousness until 2010. But the first real mention of it came from Blood on Satan's Claw director Piers Haggard, who seemed to have coined the term folk horror in relation to his film. Apparently, it was in an interview with Fangoria magazine. Fangoria magazine? Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard of it. Anyway, but he did. So seriously, though, Satan's Claw is remarkably effective as a folk horror fable for multiple reasons. First and foremost, the evil threat comes from the soil itself, as a country yokel ploughing a field unearths the devil's skull. And then there's the use of picturesque landscapes as an effective juxtaposition for the horrors that take place there. The horrors arise in this tiny rural community like a bubbling virus. It has to be said, though, that the cinematography in Satan's Claw seems deliberately drained of vibrancy as sort of an ominous visual sign that the devil has all the best hues. But putting the film in context, and indeed Witchfinder General, I should mention that on both of these horror classics came along at a point when traditional Hammer horrors were on the way out at the box office. Now, Hammer are very popular with readers of my magazine, and it still is. And it has that fabulous sort of I don't know, that's nostalgia value. That there's 3 things I think that have great nostalgia value. There's the Hammer films, old Hammer horrors. There's Carry On films, whether you agree with the non-PC jokes or not, and there's old Bond films, and there's kind of 3 things, the old-fashioned stuff. But people still like them. But I guess they're people of a certain age, so maybe not you lot, but we'll see. But anyway, by contrast, Hammer films at this time were sort of very resolutely studio bound, aside from maybe a few trips to the nearby Black Park for stuff. And Hammer certainly didn't make too many excursions into what we may also call daylight horror. I mean, yeah, they shot a lot of their stuff day for night, fine, but most of their horrors were classic Gothics when they were doing it best. So I'd say there's very few Hammer horrors that there's something you probably fit into the folk horror category, maybe Vampire Circus and some of those movies have a folk horror component to them. But generally, I think you have a hard time making a case for a lot of these films as folk horror. Anyway, so excursions into what we may also call daylight horror, which is a key component of the folk horror genre. So spooky late night stuff is all very well, but a moonlight mood with flickering candles is not an essential component for your average folk horror entry. I don't think so anyway. The Wicker Man, of course, released in 1970, is probably the ultimate folk horror classic. And I remember encountering this, and it actually went around cinemas. This is the thing that I saw at the cinema in 71 when it came out, and it was on a double bill with Don't Look Now, which are 2 of the, how great, the cinema double bill with Don't Look Now. And if there's ever been a more incredible double header than that in horror history, then I'd like to hear about it. Troll 1 and 2 doesn't count, in case you're going to ask me about that afterwards, as I'm sure you all know. Anyway, this Wicker Man, this seminal British horror movie, and it's a harrowing, relentlessly downbeat shocker. and it's scripted by noted playwright Anthony Shaffer and starring Edward Woodward as a stoic Christian copper who's sent to the island community of Summerall to investigate the mysterious disappearance of a child. And so, taking room at a local inn run by Lindsay Kemp and his sexy daughter, Britt Eklund, our prudish hero is shocked at the ribald songs he hears from the locals and the sight of the couples openly making love in the cemetery. So he begins to suspect the missing girls were used as a human sacrifice in a pagan ritual, but the horrific final scenes reveal, of course, he's made a fatal miscalculation. Anyway, but highlights of this sort of eerie and erotic fable include Britt Eklund's sexy midnight dance, where it's a body double, really, and a really nasty climax where, of course, we finally learn who or what the Wicker Man really is. Now, Christopher Lee, in one of his favourite roles, it appears as the island squire, Lord Summerard, and Ingrid Peart plays against type as a librarian. And there's great use of local colour, and the folk music also is a very important part of this genre masterpiece directed by Robin Hardy. Paganism is at the root of the Wicker Man, and to put this in context, this had played a big part of the hippie movement in the late 60s. Peace and love and flowers in your hair. If you went to San Francisco, I didn't go there, but I was around. I could have done, and I'm certainly down Carnaby Street in the 60s, and given way to an entirely different thing on all this peace and love had given way to an entirely different thing on Summerall, where poor Edward Woodward had a terrible. I said that properly. Edward Woodward, that was good. Had a terrible fate in store for him. Anyway, the music in The Wicker Man was as important as its beautiful locations, its folk-based soundtrack and use of ancient rituals and mythology was down to musician Paul Giovanni, who really understood what the film was all about. His is sort of diegetic music, a music that's heard and experienced by the people in the world of the film, and it gives us an inside track to their mindset. But let's not even discuss the Nicolas Cage remake, where the director in advance dismissed the music of the original as unimportant. So he didn't get it at all, as we knew, as we could see. Although you can always rely on Nicolas Cage to make great films. As I've already mentioned, the term folk, that's my daughter says, sorry, Nick Cage always makes great films. As I've already mentioned, the term folk horror didn't really come into common use until relatively recently, but once we start to think about it and discuss it, we can see that it has been with us since the very birth of the movies. So my nomination for the very first folk horror picture goes to Haxan, made in 1921, which was subtitled Witchcraft Through the Ages. This is really a milestone silent movie from Sweden, and it stages literary accounts of the inferno to let all you sinners who spend your days watching snuff movies know what awaits you in old Nick's domain. A typical day down below involves kissing the evil one's bum and giving birth to furry baby demons, where demi-devils hover in attendance enthusiastically spanking their satanic monkeys. Elsewhere, a demon is pouring the foul contents of its horn down a man's throat. Meanwhile, within the monastery walls, pious monks flagellate each other to keep lustful thoughts at bay, their faces contorted in what could be spiritual agony or sexual ecstasy. Blimey. There's never a dull moment in Beelzebub's place, that's for sure. Anyway, the most expensive Swedish film made at the time, Haxan, was deemed so shocking and perverse that it was banned throughout the United States. It still maintains its power to enthrall and is served to this day, and it's a must-see for folk horror fans. Director Benjamin Christensen conceived of the idea for it after coming across a copy of Malleus Maleficarum, in a Berlin bookstore in 1919. The 1487 treatise, also known as The Hammer of Witches, was written by the disgraced German clergyman Heinrich Kramer, and it was the most detailed text on the late medieval beliefs about witchcraft, containing instructions on how to discover and persecute witches. Christensen was spellbound, and he immediately dove into 2 years of research on witch hunts. He approached Haxan as a serious academic study of witch hysteria, but his incredible cinematic eye ended up revolutionising the documentary genre, functioning almost exactly like the docudramas of today. Historical images are presented in the manner of an academic lecture, but are interspersed with dramatic reenactments, sometimes as dramatised vignettes or full-blown mini-narratives. Haxan is an astonishing film, but the horror of its imagery, along with the nudity, blasphemy, and overall depiction of the church as corrupt, leering, and sadistic, makes it clear why it was widely banned at the time of its release. But its influence on folk horror can be seen everywhere. As to the very first example of folk horror, well, as many regard this as a film called The Devil's Castle, which was filmed way back in 1896 by trick photography movie pioneer Georges Méliès. Released in the United States as The Haunted Castle, it tells the story of the main character's encounter with the devil and with various attendant phantoms. It was filmed outside in the garden of Méliès's property in Montreal, Saint-Saint-Denis, sorry. I never did French at school, so cut me some slack. With painted scenery, and it combines horror and location with the devil finally being sent packing by the brandishing of a crucifix. So paganism is, of course, a vital ingredient of folk horror. And naive outsiders coming up against these forces form the backbone of many a folk horror tale. Like the 1952 Finnish movie The White Reindeer, which it fits comfortably into the subgenre with its tale of a lonely bride transformed into a vampiric reindeer, an idea derived from Finnish mythology and Sami shamanism. In the snowy landscape, Parita and reindeer herder Aslak meet and soon marry, but Aslak must spend time away for work, leaving his new bride on her own. In an effort to alleviate her loneliness and ignite marital passion, Parita visits the local shaman, who indeed helps her out, but in the process turns her into a shape-shifting vampiric white reindeer. Well, yeah, there's always a downside. The village's men are drawn to her, though, and pursue her with tragic results. It's the only Finnish film to win a Golden Globe, although they don't have as much respect these days. But this rarity is well worth seeking out, though, and I would recommend it. And also, there's a great film called Valerie and Her A Week of Wonders, which is my magazine designer Kevin's favourite film, which is also, I put that into that same sort of category, which is terrific. Right, when talking of folk horror, one might think that the subgenre would be restricted to British films, but the genre travels well. And the USA, I think, provides more isolated communities and desolate landscapes to establish an eerie backdrop to such tales. It's kind of the deliverance factor in some respects. By its very nature, folk horror is rural, so the very opposite of, say, Roman Polanski's Rosemary Baby, which has urban terrors. But, folk horror can be the scary side of the Waltons, really. So if you were really pushing the family that stays together angle, I guess you could include the Texas Chainsaw Family, the Hills of Eyes mutants in the equation as well. The only reason I prefer to leave them out is that they don't have any pagan aspects to their characters. They just want to serve up a good human barbecue. But in the case of Chainsaw, however, it's interesting that the killers make elaborate, seemingly pagan shrines out of bones and decaying corpses. So there is a slight element about that there. But on the other hand, a film like Race with the Devil, which definitely makes it into my folk horror favourites list. It's hopefully most of you have seen it, but those who haven't are in for a treat. It was made by biker movie specialist Jack Starrett, who was as an actor, he was the bullying cop who fell out of the helicopter in the first Rambo film, First Blood. But anyway, Jack Starrett scored his biggest box office success with this fast-moving, hugely enjoyable mixture of creepy witchcraft chills and spectacular stunt-driving action. Peter Fonda, Warren Oates, and their respective spouses, Loretta Swit and Lara Parker, take a vacation to the wilds of Texas in their luxury camper van. But while parked in a remote location, they accidentally witness a devil-worshipping cult holding a human sacrifice, which leads them to being pursued across the country by the vengeful Satanists. Well, I love this film. Nicely acted by the principals. This movie kept you on the edge of your seat throughout, and it was effectively alternating creepy supernatural moments with well-staged road chases. And the highlight was a lengthy action scene where members of the cult keep leaping on the fast-moving camper van from pickup trucks and cars while Fonda tries to save them off. And the film has a lot in folk horror common with The Brotherhood of Satan from 1971, another pretty decent little witchcraft chiller, in which the slaughter of 26 people within 72 hours terrifies a small town cut off from all communication. Well, it would do, wouldn't it? The excellent Strother Martin stars in it, and he got a juicy lead role for a change. He's normally a character actor in this thing. Normally gets down the cast. He plays the head of a modern devil cult whose elderly members plan to transfer their souls from the bodies they inhabit to those of young children. Among the powers wielded by the Satanists is the ability to turn children's toys into instruments of destruction. And there's a great scene where a toy tank suddenly becomes life-size and crushes a station wagon and its occupants. But back in the UK, Okay, so one of our most notable exponents of folk horror was the legendary Montague Rhodes James, who my academic friends out there can celebrate as one of their own. An English author and medievalist scholar, he was Provost of King's College, Cambridge between 1905 and 1918, and of Eton College between 1918 and 1936. Known as the originator of the antiquarian ghost story, he set his ghostly tales in then modern settings, though his protagonists and plots tended to reflect his own antiquarian interests. Many of his tales were written as Christmas Eve entertainments and read aloud to friends. This idea was used by the BBC in 2000 when they filmed Christopher Lee reading James's stories in a candlelit room in King's College. Whistle, I'll Come to You, My Lad, was one of MR's most famous tales and definitely fits into the folk horror category. Named after a 1793 poem by Robert Burns, the original story concerned Parkins, a young Cambridge University professor, on his holiday in the town of Burnstow, a fictionalised version of Felixstowe in Suffolk on the southeast coast of England. While there, Parkins finds an ancient bronze whistle, which he pockets, not noting as he walks along in the desert beach that a shape of indistinct personage appears to be making great efforts to catch up with him in the distance, but to no avail. It does catch up with him later, however, in his nightmares. Well, the BBC filmed the story twice as Whistle and I'll Come to You. First in 1968 in a version directed by Jonathan Miller, starring Michael Hordern, and again in 2010 starring John Hurt and Sophie Thompson. The Miller version is the classic of the two, though Michael Hordern's absent-minded old fogey is a long way from the youthful protagonist of James's original story. M.R. James was an interesting character, maybe not too far removed from the crusty academic of the Miller version. He was never married and was probably a lifelong celibate. Many regard him as the father of folk horror in that his works often tell of the past reaching out to confuse, frighten, overwhelm, and even destroy the present. The Jamesian character is often a projection of James himself. Often they're scholars in religious and cultural antiquities whose finding of a text or an object of historical value sets off a supernatural chain of events. Such a theme was certainly present in A Warning to the Curious, which we've discussed today, first published in 1925. This is the story of Paxton, an antiquarian and archaeologist who holidays in Seaborough. This was a disguised version of Aldeburgh in Suffolk, and inadvertently stumbles across one of the 3 lost crowns of Anglia, which legendarily protect the country from invasion. Well, upon digging the crown up, Paxton is stalked by its supernatural guardian. The story was adapted by Lawrence Gordon Clark in 1972 as the second instalment of the BBC's A Ghost Story for Christmas. And as with the previous instalment, it was first broadcast on BBC One at 11 p.m. on Christmas Eve 1972. Also adapted by the BBC was James's The Treasure of Abbot Thomas, which was published in his 1904 book Ghost Stories of an Antiquary. This was a supernatural tale about a 19th century historian who, along with his protege, finds a clue to the whereabouts of hidden treasure in an old stained glass window, only to find it protected by an ancient guardian. As far as the movie is concerned, 1957's Night of the Demon, or Curse of the Demon if you saw it in America, is the classic M.R. James screen adaptation, and the film that establishes its folk horror reputation from the very start by running its main titles over shots of Stonehenge, the most architecturally sophisticated prehistoric stone circle in the world. The M.R. James story, cast in the ruins, formed the basis for the narrative, in which an American reporter, Dana Andrews, comes to England to prove that supposed demonologist Julian Carswell, played by Niall McGuinness, is a fraud. Not the Messiah, but just a very naughty boy, really. Oh, sorry, I got my films mixed up. Anyway, our intrepid imported hero soon finds out that he is wrong in his assumptions when he is passed a cursed parchment that means will soon be visited by a demon from the very pits of hell. And if he wants to prevent himself being ripped to pieces by a very impressive monster, then he must somehow get Carswell to take the parchment back. One aspect of this film that I love is Niall McGuinness's portrayal of Carswell as sort of like a seemingly comical character at first sight, seen in one of the film's most memorable scenes in a clown makeup, putting on a show for children. But the clown mask sort of soon slips and he reveals his true powers, conjuring up a thunderstorm to spoil the party before they get round to the face painting. But Carswell's not your typical movie villain. He's like a spoiled schoolboy. He treats his mother with disdain. He's been trapped into the secrets of he's tapped into the secrets of demonology to gain riches and power, yet he knows he is as vulnerable to the forces of hell as the cowering minions he controls through fear. The story's central idea of a death curse has been appropriated by many other films, of course, such as the Japanese Ringu series. But since I've talked about Night of the Demon, which, by the way, was the first film we ever showed at our Darkfest festival in London, and hopefully some of you might join us for Darkfest 5 this November, I must also give a mention to Night of the Eagle, another witchcraft classic, which we hope to screen in the future. Based on Fritz Leiber's novel Conjure Your Wife, this surprisingly scary British movie stars Peter Wingard, better known as Jason King on the telly, as a university professor who is unaware that the upward surge of his career is partly down to his wife, Janet Blair's dabbling in white witchcraft. When he discovers what she's been up to, he makes her throw away all her charms and her spell books, and pretty soon he's regretting this because the powers of darkness descend on him with a vengeance. Believable performances coupled with Richard Matheson's literate script gives this fanciful yarn plenty of creepy credibility. And director Sidney Hayers, who also made the lurid Circus of Blood, builds the tension cleverly, delivering a particularly effective climax when the stone eagle on the gates of the school comes to life to pursue a terrified Wingard. What I find most intriguing about Night of the Eagle is the way it moves the occult into a domestic country environment and suggests that neighbours who have it in for you might resort to summoning up Beelzebub rather than just sending you a harshly worded poison pen letter. But Night of the Eagle, which was known as Burn Witch Burn in America because, well, the Americans need things spelled out for them more, was scripted by the prolific Matheson, who we said he had an amazing number of great books and screenplays based on his CV, including the likes of Steven Spielberg's breakthrough TV movie Duel, The Incredible Shrinking Man, Stir of Echoes, and I Am Legend. Matheson also did the screenplay for 1968's Hammer film, The Devil Rides Out, which is one of the best films Hammer ever made. In fact, this film even delighted author Dennis Wheatley on whose classic supernatural thriller it was based. But Christopher Lee was perfect in it as well, also as the 1920s hero, the stiff upper-lipped Duke de Richelieu, a posh chap indeed, who can visit the British Museum any hour of the day or night to look at the secret arcane books always kept under lock and key. Because, as he says, the curator is a very personal friend of mine. But Lee needs to check out some magical incantations to rescue his nephew, Patrick Mower, currently to be seen in Emmerdale, and the pretty Nike Erigi from the clutches of sinister MacArthur, played by Charles Gray, and his Satanist mates. But I love this film, even if the special effects tend to let it down a bit. But the ghost of Mendes throws out a frisson or two. But the superimposed giant spider and the guy on a horse and a skull mask doesn't really cut the mustard up against today's special effects wizardry. But it's still a very good film and very chilling. And we showed it at our last Darkfest, so you may be starting to see what you're missing out on if you don't join us, maybe next time. I think it's £61 for a train ticket from Leeds to London. Right, sorry about that, more plugs. Dennis Wheatley was a writer whose work effectively channeled the post-war interest in occultism. He wrote 65 books in all, with 56 being novels and the remainder non-fiction. 11 featured the Duke de Richelieu, and 9 of these are considered black magic novels. He loved Hammer's film That Devil Rides Out, as I say, but he hated the studio's 1976 adaptation of his book To the Devil a Daughter, as did most audiences, really. And I think moving Wheatley's characters from vintage country mansions to modern-day high-rise apartments just didn't work. And it was effectively Hammer Horror's swan song, really. And that was the end of them, pretty much. Witchcraft is very much a component of folk horror. And therefore, if I had to put forward my favourite folk horror heroine, it would have to be the British actress Barbara Steele, surely. Like Christopher Lee, she was a former rank charm school graduate, but one who, unlike Christopher Lee, walked out an Elvis Presley musical to travel to Italy to appear in Fellini's 8½. But her career-making role was in 1960's Black Sunday, which was an Italian cult favourite from director Mario Bava. It was Bava's first movie, and it's probably his best movie. And it features Barbara Steele in a double role as the evil witch Princess Asa and her good counterpart Princess Katja. Based on a folk tale called The Witch, or The Vie, by Nicola Gogol, which has been filmed many times, this haunting movie kicked off with an unforgettable sequence where the bad Steele has bite mask hammered onto her face by witch hunters who are about to burn her to death at the stake. But rain puts the flames out, and 2 centuries later, her reanimated corpse is on the rampage again, causing chaos in the castle of her most hated ancestor. The nightmarish camera work suits the mood of the film perfectly, and some scenes, such as the resurrection of the witch's vampire lover, hands clawing upwards out of a muddy grave in a thunderstorm, remain in the memory like a bad dream. This is folk horror Euro style, which allows perceptive viewers to immerse themselves in Barbara's scary universe of creepy crypts, cobwebby corpses, scary old castles full of hidden passageways, and all the things that horror movies usually promise but fail to deliver. But the film was actually pretty surprising to many of you nowadays. The film was banned in England for 8 years because of scenes involving a dagger being driven through a corpse's eye and horrendous shots of creepy crawlies coming out of the mummified Asha's eyes. But Black Sunday was such a hit that Barbara Steele was typecast in witchy roles from then on. My personal favourite of these was The Long Hair of Death, which is a highly atmospheric Italian spooker about revenge from beyond the grave. Giorgio Ardisan starred as a sadistic 15th century count who got his comeuppance at the hands of ghostly Babs, who was brought back to life when a lightning bolt tears open her grave. The dialogue is laughably stilted in this one. My favourite line, because I used to have this on 8mm and we used to play it again and again and again, laugh at this line. My favourite line was when the Count's missus tells him, "I won't permit you to treat me like an old shoe," when he threatens to throw her away. And the various court intrigues get a bit confusing at times, but on a visual level, this film's close to Black Sunday, I think, with lots of memorably macabre touches, like the rats. There's a great scene where rats get inside a corpse and make it move in its coffin. And the grimly ironic ending, of course, if I won't want to give it away, but it will do anyway, but it's very similar to the famous finale of The Wicker Man. So I think that places it firmly in the folk horror territory. It should also be noted, by the way, that in 1965's Revenge of the Blood Beast, Barbara Steele played a woman who, after a car accident, morphed into the possessed spirit of a witch executed in the 1700s. And the film was the first directorial credit for Witchfinder General's Michael Reeves. Another renowned English writer who dabbled in the folk, well, more than dabbled really, in the folk horror area was Allan Blackwood. He was a member of, he's kind of forgotten man of British horror, but there's a new, the BFI did this fabulous disc of short, sharp shocks, and you find Allan Blackwood is on that in some capacity or other. He was actually introduced some of his ghost stories. But anyway, he was a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which is a secret society devoted to the study and practice of the occult, metaphysics and paranormal activities. He was a member of this during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And Blackwood's 1907 novella, The Willows, is one of his best-known works, and it was very influential on a number of later writers. The story of this one is like you've got 2 friends who are midway on a canoe trip down the Danube River. And throughout the story, Blackwood personifies the surrounding environment, river, sun, wind, etc., and imbues them with a powerful, sort of ultimately threatening character, which is obviously an ideal thing for folk horror. Most ominous are the masses of dense, desultory, menacing willows, which moved of their own will, as he says, and moved as their own will, though alive, and they touched, as though touched by some incalculable method, they touched my own keen sense of the horrible. So one element of folk horror is that it works against the traditional notion that rural living is idyllic. This is the stuff I can't find funny. So I've lost count of the number of horror films I've seen and horror novels I've read where city-dwelling families move to the countryside and they think it's going to be answered to all their questions, but then they discover that the locals are pretty scary and they're often up to no good. It also occurs to me that this kind of folk horror might be quite prescient in this day and age, because where let's face it, at the moment, extreme isolation is being forced upon a lot of us, unless you're in the government. Isolated groups are the meat and potatoes of folk horror, of course, and ungoverned, it seems that these groups can remove themselves from a normal society and return to their pagan roots at the drop of a yokel hat. I think one classic example of this can be found in Shirley Jackson's chilling story, The Lottery, which was first published in 1948 in the New Yorker magazine. The lottery takes place on June 27th, a beautiful summer's day in a small New England village where all the residents are gathering for their traditional annual lottery. The town is small enough that the lottery can be through in time to allow the villagers to get home for noonday dinner. But though the event first appears festive, it soon becomes clear that no one wants to win this lottery. Tessie Hutchinson seems unconcerned about the tradition until her family draws the dreaded mark. Then she protests that the process wasn't fair. The winner, as it turns out, will be stoned to death by the remaining residents. Tessie wins, and the story closes as the villagers, including her own family members, begin to throw rocks at her. The very title of the lottery makes it sound like the story is about something good, something we would like to win, all like to win. But that and the tale's picturesque setting, and its contrast, these contrast sharply with the horrific violence of the conclusion. And there's a lot of the Wicker Man about the lottery, and a core message that exists in a lot of folk horror tales, that of the human capacity for violence, especially when it's part of a twisted pagan tradition. When the heroine of the story is stoned to death, all of the villagers participate, so nobody takes individual responsibility or blame for their barbaric acts. And I think we all know, as we said, as has been said before, when we think about the Wicker Man, that Lord Summerarm, knows himself that if it doesn't work this year, he's going to be in Edward Woodward's place the following year. So I always find that kind of fun. Stephen King also has given us some folk horror tales, and obviously he's a much more famous author. And I put in his wide body of work, certainly Children of the Corn, which was filmed in 1984, about the young couple with Linda Hamilton and Peter Horton as a young couple motoring their way through Nebraska, who stumble across a band of vicious youngsters who have murdered the adults in their community and established a weird cult who worship a mysterious deity that lives in the cornfields. Well, growing up in rural Maine, Stephen King has sort of created his own special brand of folklore on his own doorstep, really, giving us the town of Derry, where an old creature of local legend terrorizes the hills and their residents, and Castle Rock, a setting for many battles between good and evil. We also mustn't forget the desecrated and evil Jerusalem's Lot, shortened to Salem's Lot in the book title, where an ancient vampire tries to take over. A big inspiration, however, for King's Children of the Corn was the 1973 novel Harvest Home by Tom Tryon, the former actor who starred in I Married a Monster from Outer Space in 1957. Harvest Home is regarded as a folk horror classic and tells of the Constantine family, fed up with the grind of city living, who decamp to an isolated village in New England. The family hopes that fresh air will clear their heads and revive their spirits, but it turns out, of course, their neighbours are a bit unusual. The villagers only do things the old way, not using modern farming equipment or communicating with the outside world. They celebrate weird festivals all year round and are obsessed with corn. They also have their own kind of religion, Christianity with pagan fertility rites. The book was filmed as a 5-hour miniseries in 1978 by Sean Penn's dad, Leo, with David Aykroyd and Joanna Miles as Mr. and Mrs. Constantine, and the young Rosanna Arquette as their daughter, Kate. Betty Davis starred in one of her best latter-day roles as the feared and revered matriarch of the village, the widow Fortune. The paganism here gets a feminist twist because the women rule, and men who step out of line are blinded and have their tongues cut out. So, yeah, TV, actually, thinking back on it, has actually been quite a fertile breeding ground for folk horror. One of the men behind this was Nigel Neal, a visionary author who had almost as much impact on the sci-fi genre as H.G. Wells. Neal was most well known for creating the Quatermass quadrilogy, already discussed here. He was also responsible for a groundbreaking early adaptation of George Orwell's 1984, made for the BBC Sunday Night Theatre in 1954. The totalitarian ending of Neal's script, which could have no margin for free will, appalled its audience back in the day, leading to questions being asked in Parliament about it. It revived Orwell's reputation and launched two of its players, Peter Cushing and Donald Pleasance, as specialists in the horror genre. As to Neal himself, born in Barrow-in-Furness, he grew up on the Isle of Man. He said, "There's always been a traditional belief on the Isle of Man in things you can't quite see." He studied for the Manx bar but grew bored. He then trained as an actor at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art and briefly carried Spears in Shakespeare plays at Stratford-upon-Avon. But in 1950, when he was 27, his first collection of short stories, Tomato Cane, won the Somerset Maugham Award. One of its stories, Minuk, was a folk horror tale of a very spooky house whose foundation was an ancient stone slab covering an even more ancient evil. This became quite a familiar theme in Neil's work. In 1951, Neil joined the BBC as a scriptwriter, and 2 years later came the Quatermass Experiment, for which he was paid £250. Hammer Films commissioned scripts of all 3 Quatermass stories, though he was unhappy with the casting of pugilistic American actor Brian Donlevy in the title role for the first 2. But of the original trilogy, Quatermass and the Pit had a folk horror feel about it. Neil's Manx heritage and Celtic background had imbued in him a fascination for folk tales and legends. So combining that with the theories advanced by writers on flying saucers about the possibilities of there having been ancient astronauts and the contemporary relevance of the reconstruction work that was still going on in London after the war, he came up with the premise of a commercial dig that happens upon an alien spaceship buried deep in the earth for millennia. So it is that in Quatermass and the Pit, an archaeological dig at a construction site uncovers some 5 million year old ape-men skeletons and what seems to be an ancient spacecraft. The military rank it as a secret German V weapon, but Quatermass determines that its origin is Mars, though of the long distant past. He further construes that the Homo sapiens were actually a byproduct of Martian genetic engineering, and that man's superstitious beliefs and are a result of this race memory. The craft is inadvertently reactivated, and its influence on sections of the populace begins to replicate the purges by which the Martians exterminated themselves. Wholesale violence breaks out, but an old talismanic trick to ward off evil spirits is employed, which grounds the Martian force and brings an end to the havoc. Nigel Neal served up more folk horror for Hammer in The Devil's Own, also known as The Witches, but not to be confused with the Roald Dahl tale of the same name. Aging Hollywood star Joan Fontaine starred in this one. It was a surprisingly intelligent supernatural chiller. She played a teacher who had a nervous breakdown in her mission school in Africa after a local witch doctor put a spell on her. So when she returns to England, she becomes the headmistress of a tiny village school in an idyllic rural setting. That's red flags for a start, because it seems that strange witchcraft rituals are being practiced by the locals. And one of Fontaine's schoolgirls has been earmarked as a human sacrifice. Fontaine actually owned the rights to the Nora Lofts novel on which this was based, and it became her last feature film. And Nigel Neal, the screenplay is a very literate screenplay. But it was scary without being hokey or obvious, dealing as it does with our fascination with the occult and its potential power over small communities. The Devil Own is, in my opinion, a minor classic of the folk horror genre. But, sadly, it didn't do well for Hammer. It was not as successful because it is just too low-key and too intelligent, maybe in some ways. But more Nigel Neal folk horror came our way for the small screen when he did this thing called the Stone Tape for the BBC in 1972. And it was a highly atmospheric ghost story with folk horror undertones that centred around scientists who move into their new headquarters, a Gothic mansion, where they find one room unfinished. Strange noises are heard, and the builders are too frightened to complete their work. When the other scientists dismiss such fears as irrational whimsy, only psychically minded Jill, played by Jane Asher, senses the dark secret that lurks beneath the building. You can see this one on DVD these days, and it's a technological ghost story, and it's still renowned among aficionados for the twist in its tale. And it's got a great folk horror feel. And further exploiting the author's ability to turn out classic TV horror, the BBC commissioned him to write Beasts in 1976, a standalone series featuring 6 tales of terror, beginning with Special Offer, a story of a clumsy shop girl, played by Pauline Quirk, who becomes convinced that there is something sinister living behind the walls of the shop where she works. I suppose the most famous folk horror entry in the series was called Baby, and told of a young couple expecting their first child, and they move into a converted farmhouse where they discover an urn hidden in a wall cavity that contains the body of a strange mutant creature. Having said that, actually, come to think of it, probably the most famous story was actually during Barty's party, in which a couple are alone in an isolated cottage with only a radio for company until a legion of intelligent rats start to invade their home. That's certainly the one that everyone puts in their favourite list. But going back to Nigel Kneale again, continuing with Nigel Kneale, his final Quatermass serial, the Quatermass Conclusion, involved hippies and Stonehenge. So that show definitely has its roots in the folk horror genre. But the latter part of the 70s may have been bleaker in Kneale's eyes than the times in which he had set his previous Quatermass adventures. Because in focusing on Quatermass Conclusion, it focuses on urban decay and alienated youth. But really, Kneale was by then too old to really have too much to say on the subject. I think he picked the wrong targets at which to poke his usually prescient stick. And then he compounded the error by marrying them to a somewhat preposterous plot. But in this one, anyway, the Quatermass Conclusion, a quasi-religious cult known as the Planet People are seemingly beamed into outer space during ceremonial gathering at Stonehenge. Quatermass discovers the source of the beam is an alien civilization which is harvesting humans for food in the way that a whale might swallow plankton. His strange solution to this is one of self-sacrifice by means of the ubiquitous atomic bomb. But this wasn't the end of Kneale and folk horror, of course, but in 1982 he got involved with writing the screenplay for John Carpenter's Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, a sequel that was somewhat odd in the scheme of things, because Haddonfield's indestructible killer, Michael Myers, didn't get a look in this one. And instead, Kneale's screenplay revolved around a mad Irish toy maker played by Dan O'Hurley, who was out to restore the horror to Halloween by creating Halloween masks which do horrible things to those who wear them. Kneale's concept made interesting reference to microchips containing pieces of Stonehenge. But because of disagreements between the writer and the filmmakers, Kneale retracted his name from the final credits. According to Carpenter, Kneale's original screenplay was too bitter in its anti-Irish spirit, while Kneale was said to be repulsed by the film's graphic violence and gore. At the time of his death in 2006, Nigel Kneale was working on a prequel to his 4 serials, Quatermass and the Third Reich, which envisaged his professor as a young man on sabbatical in the Berlin of 1936 and meeting with Werner von Braun, the Rocket Man, the original Rocket Man. The Nazis' obsession with mysticism and the occult seems somehow to be associated with their rocket experiments in this one. But sadly, the Quatermass, this last Quatermass story was never done, so we'll not know how it turned out. It's a shame. But anyway, other TV classics of folk horror that I think I should mention on the way was John Bowen's Robin Redbreast, made by the BBC in 1970. The plot of this was a familiar one, but the way it played out was not. Anna Cropper was Nora, an urban socialite seeking peace and quiet in a remote country house. And the locals seem friendly enough, if maybe a bit eccentric, and she begins a relationship with Rob, Anthony Bradford, a very strange young man who practices martial arts in his underpants in the woods. She soon becomes pregnant and plans to abort the baby and move back to her urban roots. But a last-minute change of heart forces her to return to the village, where she discovers she may have been a pawn in a strange conspiracy and begins to fear for her life and that the locals might have sinister plans for her unborn child. Writer John Bowen took inspiration for his script from a real-life ritual murder of a farmhand in an English village of Lower Quinton on St. Valentine's Day, 1945. And which was also supposedly the inspiration for David Pinner's 1967 novel Ritual, which would be adapted as The Wicker Man. Originally broadcast in colour, Robin Redbreast sadly now only survives as a 16mm black and white film copy, the original master tape having been wiped long ago. It's definitely one to see, however, if you want to study folk horror in its purest form. And so too is 1974's Panda's Fen, directed by Alan Clark, the great Alan Clark, and written by acclaimed British playwright David Rudkin, who described its strange storyline thus. As David Rudkin said, in the pastoral landscape with 3 choirs England, a clergyman's son in his last days of school has his idealistic value system and the precious tokens of his self-image all broken away. His parentage, his nationality, his sexuality, his conventional patriotism, and his faith. Below the slopes of the Malvern Hills, he has encounters with an angel and with a demon, with the ghost of Elgar, the crucified Jesus, and with Penda, England's last pagan king. In the final image, he turns away from his idealised landscape to go into the world and adulthood with a value system more anarchistic now and readier to integrate the contradictions of his experience. Well, it's quite sort of intellectual stuff for its day. But it was aired as a BBC play for BBC in the BBC on the BBC as a play in their Play for Today strand. But Penda's Fen is now considered a folk horror classic, and it has a potent mix of mysticism, music, and landscape, and it taps into the elemental truth about who we are and our pagan past. I think the only thing now, looking at it now, the only thing that is a shame about it is the posh BBC accents, but then you can't have anything. But anyway, strangely enough, one of the most potent folk horror projects of the 1970s was made for a kiddie audience, and I'm talking about 1977's Children of the Stones, written by Trevor Ray and Jeremy Burnham. It was perhaps one of the scariest children's programmes ever made. Blake Seven's Gareth Thomas starred in it as astrophysicist Dr. Adam Brake, arriving in the country village of Milbury, which was actually Avebury in real life, with its famous stones, with his son Matthew for a 3-month summer project measuring the magnetic properties of the standing stones in the isolated village. So they quickly make the acquaintance of Margaret Smythe, who runs the local museum, and their daughter Sandra, both not long arrived themselves. So there's 2 lots of newcomers here. Comparing notes on the oddball villagers who have an unnerving habit of wishing everyone happy day, they begin to feel all is not right in Milbury. Local misfit and poacher Di, played by Freddie Jones, adds to the mystery, offering warnings about the future and the past as one by one their friends and acquaintances succumb to occult forces and unthinking conformity. Bit of an invasion of the body snatcher type thing going on there. Turns out the stones are connected to a black hole whose power is being harnessed by the village's leader, Hendrik, played by Ian Cuthbertson, to wipe all free will and negative thoughts from the populace. As I said, Avebury was the perfect location for the show, of course, because the Wiltshire village is a Neolithic henge monument containing 3 stone circles and one of the best-known prehistoric sites in Britain. It's both a tourist attraction and a place of religious importance to contemporary pagans. Anyway, since I've touched on stuff that was scary for kids, I might take a diversion into the many, frankly, quite terrifying public information films that were made in the 1970s, like 1977's Apaches, which in this one, it was not all fun and games down on the farm. It was a classic public information film from John Mackenzie, the director of The Long Good Friday. Apaches sees kids taking their cowboy games too far. One child is buried alive in slurry, while another accidentally drinks some weed killer. And it ended with a list of the names of children actually killed at farms in the past year by impalement, electrocution, and all sorts. When I was a kid, I really admit, many mates and I used to play on railway lines, often putting pennies on the line to see how squashed out of shape they would get. This is in the days when they had puffer trains coming, you could hear them coming a mile off, but it was probably still a silly thing to do. But ramming that point home was a 1977 short called The Finishing Line, which is surely one of the most disturbing and graphic public information films that was ever made, really. A railway line is used as a scene for an Olympic Games style tournament, which ends in numerous children getting either killed or seriously injured. In fact, at initial screenings in schools for this one, the film had a huge impact, with some children fainting, apparently, and others stunned into silence. When it was shown on television, however, there was an outcry which led to the film being banned for more than 20 years. Again, you know, I think the BFI put it out on one of their shorts things. It's definitely worth catching up with. Another such short film that had, and again on the same BFI Short Sharp Shocks program, was 1973's Lonely Water, which was designed to stop high-spirited children playing in or near rivers, ponds, and other water hazards. It opened with a creepy narration by the great Donald Pleasance, who said, "I am the spirit of dark and lonely water, ready to trap the unwary, to show off the fool, and this is the kind of place you'd expect to find me." As well as Haddonfield, I guess. But so anyway, but in this one, Pleasance appeared as the cloaked figure of death, and he was in the film throughout the film companies. Yeah, so he sort of lurks around as the figure of death. In fact, the film company's accountant took the physical role in the film, and Donald just did the narration. Scariest thing about this is the perverse sadistic enjoyment that the spirit seems to be taking in. He seems to be having fun watching these young unfortunates drown. And at one point, he seems quite gleeful as he describes a scrapyard as the perfect place for an accident. In more recent times, folk horror has become a big thing thanks to popular movies such as Midsummer and The Witch. Midsummer was released in 2019 and follows a group of friends who travel to Sweden for a festival that occurs once every 90 years. Only, of course, they find themselves in the clutches of a Scandinavian pagan cult. Apparently, this was first conceived as a straightforward slasher film set among Swedish cultists, but director Ari Aster had recently been through a difficult breakup and devised a screenplay which made a deteriorating relationship the central conflict. The Hollywood Reporter described the film as the horror equivalent of a destination wedding. Its pagan elements played out like an update of The Wicker Man. And 2015's The Witch as well, of course, and that's touch on that. It tellingly advertised itself as a New England folk tale instead of a fairy tale. Set in 1630s New England, it focuses on an American colonial family as they undergo what seems to be an otherworldly curse. When the father defies the local church, he is banished along with his family to a desolate rural location where the forbidding landscape and creeping isolation begin to take their toll. The family's crops fail without reason, and their newborn son vanishes without a trace. Eaten away by hunger and paranoia, blame repeatedly rests on the shoulders of their oldest daughter, played by the Queen's Gambit's Anya Taylor-Joy, who was minding the infant when he disappeared. When Thomasin's younger siblings accuse her of witchcraft, the family's mounting inexplicable tragedies become the devilish work of a teenage girl, with Thomasin backed up into a corner by her own flesh and blood. British filmmaker Ben Wheatley also has famously dabbled in the folk horror field with a kill list in the field in England. Kill List, of course, follows two former soldiers turned hitmen, played by Neil Maskell and Michael Smiley. It's been 1 year since a botched job in Kiev, and the pair are desperate for work, so they're approached by a mysterious client. And this deadly duo are presented with a seemingly lucrative assignment, 3 killings for a large sum. But what follows is an increasingly labyrinthian nightmare of conspiracies and coincidences that will keep you guessing until the film's absolutely brutal final act, where it goes into the folk horror territory. It was widely hailed as one of the best horror films of the 21st century, really, and it's quite sadistic. A field in England, even more folk horror, takes place in, well, I'm sure you can guess. It's a pastoral fever dream where it's kind of light on plot and heavy on an unrelenting and increasingly trippy atmosphere. Set in the throes of the English Civil War, the film follows a handful of deserters in search of a stiff drink who fall under the dark spell of a character named O'Neill, played by Kill List Michael Smiley. An avowed necromancer and practitioner of the dark arts, he terrorizes them into helping him find a buried stash of gold. And but of course, all this is while they're under the influence of magic mushrooms. It's a very grimy, gritty, and nasty movie. And Michael Smiley's character definitely has a touch of the Vincent Price witch kind of general about him. There is a great deal nastier. It's definitely not a date night movie, nor is it advisable viewing for those who can't watch flash photography, because strobe effects kick in big time during the psychedelic magic mushroom sequences. Anyway, I've rattled on long enough, I'm sure I have. I hope you haven't fallen asleep, but I guess I should be getting to the summing up stages now. And I'd just like to say a hearty thanks to those of you who have stayed the course. My wife Yanni has never listened to any of my DVD commentaries because, for example, she says she hates it when I talk through films. But I've been listening to many of the amazing speakers who have been contributing to this fabulous event, so expertly curated by Melody Blackmore. And it's certainly given me many new insights into the folk horror genre, which I'm sure I will continue to explore within the pages of The Dark Side. It seems to me, however, that folk horror is going through some fascinating changes today. The genre is all about community, usually an insular one. M. Night Shyamalan's The Village is another good example of what I'm talking about. But we're in the age of the internet now, and we're in online community. So is the quite terrifying. I mean, there's one film, I don't know if it it qualifies for horror. Maybe the quite terrifying recent Zoom horror film, The Host, hits pretty close to home in this, considering how we're holding this event and this new conference. So is this the new type of folk horror? Don't know. You guys probably be more qualified to say. But as I said at the start, it's a broad church, and as long as there are folk, there will be horror. So thank you for inviting me, and now take a deep breath. We can all chat about what folk horror means to you. Thank you.